At 31 years old, Mercy Calloway stood at the edge of a dirt road in the Wyoming Territory with $11 sewn into the hem of her skirt and nowhere on earth that wanted her. Her stepbrother, Hollis Pruitt, had ridden her out to the county line himself, his wagon wheels grinding over frost-hard ruts, and told her plainly that the house her father built was his now, signed and notarized, and that a grown woman with no husband and no sons had no claim on a dead man's property in the eyes of the law or in the eyes of God, as he understood him. All her father had left her, scrawled in a separate deed Hollis had laughed at and nearly burned, was 60 acres of rocky nothing 2 days' ride west, land worthless but for a waterfall that thundered down a granite face into a canyon nobody farmed, nobody grazed, nobody wanted. Mercy used 4 of her $11 to register the deed in her own name at the territorial office, because it was hers and because it was, despite everything, the only thing in the world that still bore her father's signature beside her own. She walked the 60 acres the way a woman walks into a church she no longer believes will save her, and what she found sealed behind that endless curtain of falling water would not only return to her everything Hollis Pruitt had stolen, but would resurrect a town that had been quietly dying for 15 years. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Mercy Calloway. If you are watching this from a place that the world has written off as worthless, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Mercy had been born in 1853 in a cabin not far from where the waterfall now roared, in the years when the territory was still more rumor than government, when her father, Thomas Calloway, had come west not for gold but for stone. He was a man who read the land the way other men read scripture, who could press his palm to a hillside and tell you what minerals slept beneath it, who had learned his trade in the slate quarries of Pennsylvania before the war took his brothers and left him the last Calloway man standing east of the Mississippi. He came west because the east held nothing for him but graves, and he brought with him only a set of surveying tools, a Bible with his mother's handwriting in the margins, and a young wife named Eleanor who died bringing Mercy into the world on a night so cold the midwife later said she'd seen icicles form on the inside of the cabin walls. Thomas never remarried for love, though he took a second wife, Bertha Pruitt, a widow with a young son named Hollis, mostly so that Mercy would have a mother's hands in the house and so the boy would have a father's. It was a practical arrangement that never warmed into true family, and Mercy grew up feeling always like a guest in a house that was, in fact, entirely hers by blood and right. What her father gave her, in place of softness, was a trade. Thomas Calloway was a man who understood stone and water and the slow architecture of the earth, and from the time Mercy could walk he took her with him into the hills, teaching her to read the strata in a canyon wall, to find where water had carved its patient path through rock over 10,000 years, to understand that nothing in the natural world was ever truly empty or truly worthless, only waiting to be properly seen. He taught her to douse for water with a forked willow branch, though he always said the willow was less magic than attention, that a person who studied the lay of land long enough could feel where water wanted to go even without the stick trembling in her hands. He taught her masonry too, how to set a stone so it would never shift, how to read which rock would split clean and which would shatter, and by the time she was 16 she could build a wall as true as any man in the territory, though no one would hire a woman to do it, and so she built only for her father and for herself, and for the small Sunday school chapel in the town of Larkspur Hollow, the little settlement 2 miles from their cabin that had grown up around a silver strike in the 60s and had been slowly, quietly dying ever since the vein gave out in 1871. Larkspur Hollow was the kind of town the railroad had bypassed and the rivers had forgotten. It had once held 400 souls and now held barely 90, mostly old miners too stubborn to leave and their wives and a scattering of children who would, everyone understood, leave the moment they were grown. The town's single great wound, the one that had driven away most of the people who'd departed, was its water. The old mining operations had diverted and fouled the natural creek that once ran through the valley, and for 15 years the town had survived on a single deep well that ran low every August, forcing families to haul water by wagon from springs miles distant, forcing the modest farms around the town to wither year after year, forcing young families to pack their wagons and follow the railroad toward places where water was not a daily, grinding worry. Thomas Calloway had spent the last years of his life obsessed, in the quiet way of a man who does not speak of his obsessions but lives inside them, with the question of where Larkspur Hollow's water had gone, certain in his bones that the creek that had once watered the valley had not simply dried up but had been diverted, somewhere up in the rocks, by the same mining operations that had stripped the silver and left. He believed, though he never said it plainly to anyone but Mercy, that if a man could find where that water had been turned aside, he could turn it back, and save the town that had become, despite everything, the only true community either of them had ever known. It was this belief, this quiet inheritance of purpose, more than any skill with stone, that Thomas Calloway left his daughter, though neither of them understood yet what shape that inheritance would finally take. Thomas died in the winter of 1884, of a fever that took him fast and left no time for him to explain whatever he had learned in his last seasons of climbing alone into the high rocks above the falls with his surveying tools and his old leather notebook, the notebook that Hollis Pruitt, in his haste to claim the estate, never thought to search for, and that Mercy, in her grief, did not think to look for either, not yet. The fall came swiftly and with a cruelty that still, years later, made the women of Larkspur Hollow shake their heads when they spoke of it. Hollis Pruitt had never loved Thomas Calloway, had resented from boyhood being raised in another man's house under another man's rules, and he had certainly never loved Mercy, whom he regarded as a rival for whatever inheritance might come, despite the fact that under any decent reading of fairness the house and land were Mercy's by blood while Hollis was kin only by his mother's second marriage. But Hollis had learned the law better than he had learned honor, and in the territory in those years a woman's claim to property, even property her own father had built and willed to her, could be challenged and often broken by a man with money enough to pay a lawyer and a judge inclined to see things his way. Hollis produced a will, conveniently discovered after Thomas's death, naming him sole heir to the house, the furnishings, the small herd of cattle, and the modest savings Thomas had kept in the bank at Cheyenne. Mercy suspected the will was forged from the moment she saw it, for her father's signature on it leaned the wrong way, slanted backward instead of forward as his hand always had, but she had no money for a lawyer of her own and no men in town willing to stand against Hollis Pruitt, who had begun, even before his stepfather was cold in the ground, to make clear that anyone who sided with Mercy would find their own debts called in, their own small mortgages suddenly inconvenient, for Hollis had quietly bought up notes on half the town's modest properties in the months before Thomas's death, as though he had known, or hoped, that his stepfather's time was short. So it was that on a March morning with the last snow still gray and crusted in the wagon ruts, Hollis loaded what little Mercy could carry into the back of his wagon, drove her not gently to the county line, and left her there with her trunk, her father's old Bible which he had not thought valuable enough to keep, and the deed to 60 worthless acres he had laughed at, calling it her father's idea of a joke, a parcel of canyon and waterfall that no man would ever pay good money for, since it could not be farmed, could not be grazed, could not be mined, was simply a hole in the earth with water falling into it. Mercy stood in the road and watched him drive away and felt, for the first time in her life, the particular cold of being entirely alone in the world, owning nothing but $11, a deed to land considered a joke, and whatever was left of her father's teaching about how nothing in this world is ever truly empty. She walked the 2 days to her father's worthless acres because she had nowhere else to walk to, and because some stubborn instinct, the same instinct her father had planted in her since childhood, told her that a man like Thomas Calloway did not leave a parcel of land to his only daughter as a joke. She arrived at the canyon's edge on the evening of the second day, her feet blistered through her boots, and stood listening to the waterfall thunder into the gorge below, a column of white water perhaps 80 feet high, dropping from a granite shelf into a deep green pool, the spray rising in a constant soft mist that caught the last orange light of evening and threw small trembling rainbows across the rock face. It was, she would later say, the first beautiful thing she had seen since her father died, and something in her chest loosened at the sight of it, a grief and a strange peace arriving together. She made camp that first night beneath an overhang of rock near the pool, ate the last of the bread she'd carried, and slept better than she had in weeks, lulled by the endless steady roar of the water, which her father had once told her was, if you listen long enough, not noise at all but a kind of conversation the land was always having with itself. It was on her third morning at the falls, while she was exploring the narrow game trail that wound along the canyon wall behind the curtain of falling water, searching mostly for a dry place to build some kind of shelter before the spring rains came, that Mercy first noticed the strangeness of the rock face directly behind the falls. The water dropped from a shelf that overhung the cliff slightly, leaving a gap of perhaps 8 feet between the falling water and the stone wall behind it, a narrow damp corridor she could walk through, dim and roaring and rainbow-lit, the kind of secret passage a child might dream of. And there, where the corridor widened into a shallow cave, she found what at first she took to be only an unusual configuration of stone, a section of wall too regular, too deliberately stacked, to be the work of weather and time alone. She had spent her whole childhood learning to read stone from her father, learning which walls were nature's accident and which were built by human hands, and what she was looking at, beneath a skin of moss and mineral deposit built up over what must have been a decade or more, was a wall of fitted, mortared stone, a wall built the way her father had taught her to build, with a particular interlocking pattern he called the Callaway lock, a technique he said his own father had taught him in the Pennsylvania quarries, one she had never seen another mason use. Her father had been here. Her father had built something here, hidden behind the curtain of his own worthless waterfall, and had told no one. It took her the better part of 2 more days, working with a flat stone as a chisel and her bare, blistered hands, to find the seam in the masonry that marked a door rather than simply a wall, a section perhaps 3 feet wide that had been built to be removable, fitted not with mortar but with a clever dry-stacked interlocking that came apart, once she understood the pattern, almost like a puzzle box. Behind it was not, as she had half feared and half hoped, a cave of natural stone, but a small constructed room, a cabin in truth though built of stone rather than timber, no larger than a modest parlor, dry as a bone despite the roaring water just beyond its hidden door, lit by a narrow chimney shaft her father had cut up through the rock to let in air and a thin column of daylight. Inside, arranged with the careful order of a man who had visited this place many times and meant for it to be found by someone who would understand it, were a small iron stove, a narrow cot, a shelf of canned provisions long since spoiled, a strongbox, and resting on a stone table at the room's center as though placed there for her specifically, her father's leather notebook, the one she had not thought to look for in the chaos of his death, its cover swollen with damp but its pages, when she opened it with trembling hands, still legible, filled with her father's careful surveyor's hand. What she read in the days that followed, working through the notebook by the light of her small fire while the falls roared their endless conversation just beyond the hidden door, deepened the mystery of her inheritance into something far larger than she had imagined. Her father had not built this hidden room as a retreat or a folly. He had built it as a base of operations for a project he had pursued in secret for the last 3 years of his life, ever since he had finally proven to his own satisfaction what he had long suspected, that the creek which once watered Larkspur Hollow had not dried up at all but had been deliberately diverted, decades earlier, by the men who ran the old Larkspur Silver Company, who had dammed and redirected the natural watercourse high in the rocks above the valley in order to power their stamp mills more efficiently, and who had simply never bothered to restore the natural flow once the silver gave out and they abandoned the valley, leaving the town below to wither without explanation, the diversion itself buried under landslide and decades of brush so thoroughly that no one remaining in Larkspur Hollow even remembered the creek had ever run a different course. Thomas Calloway had spent years tracing the old company's water rights filings in the territorial records, had climbed these canyons alone season after season mapping the buried channel, and had concluded, in notes dated only months before his death, that the original creek could be restored, that the diversion dam, though decayed, could be breached, and that the water that now fell, wasted and unclaimed, over this very waterfall on his own worthless land, was in fact the very water Larkspur Hollow had been starving for 15 years, water that with proper engineering could be returned to its old course and brought back to the dying town below. But there was more in that notebook than engineering notes, and this was the secret that turned Mercy's understanding of her own father inside out. In the strongbox beside the notebook, locked but with its small brass key tucked into the notebook's back pages as though her father had trusted she would find both together, Mercy discovered the original 1866 charter and water rights filing for the Larkspur Silver Company, the actual legal document establishing that the company, and by extension whoever held its dissolved assets, had claimed exclusive rights not only to the silver but to the entire watercourse of the valley, rights that had never been formally relinquished even after the company folded, rights that, Mercy slowly understood reading her father's careful annotations, had been quietly purchased at auction for almost nothing in 1879, the year of the silver bust, by a buyer whose name was recorded in the filing in plain ink, H. Pruitt, acting as agent for his mother's estate. Hollis Pruitt, or rather Hollis's late father before him and the estate Hollis had since absorbed, had owned the legal right to that water for years, the very water his own stepfamily's neighbors in Larkspur Hollow had been dying of thirst without, and had done nothing with it but let it lie dormant, a worthless asset on paper, never once telling the town what he held, never once offering to restore the flow that could have saved a dozen farms and kept 100 families from leaving. Thomas Calloway, Mercy realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold spray of the falls, had discovered this years before his death, had likely confronted Hollis about it privately, or had at least begun the legal work to challenge the dormant claim under the territory's use it or lose it water doctrine, and had been killed by fever before he could finish what he started, leaving behind only this hidden room, this notebook and a worthless parcel of waterfall land that was Mercy. Now understood, no joke at all but the single key piece of ground from which the entire diversion could be reached and rebuilt, deliberately willed to her and to no one else. She sat for a long while in that small stone room with the notebook open on her lap and the strongbox papers spread before her, and felt something settle inside her that was not quite grief and not quite anger but a fierce, quiet resolve she did not yet have words for. Her father had not left her nothing. He had left her the only thing that mattered, a true purpose, hidden behind water the way the truest things so often are, visible only to someone willing to walk through the roar and the cold and the dark to find them. Restoring the diversion, Mercy soon learned, would require more than resolve. The old dam her father had mapped sat nearly a mile up canyon, a structure of timber and packed earth built by the Silver Company's engineers decades before, now half collapsed and overgrown but still, according to her father's surveys, holding back perhaps 2/3 of the original creek's flow, sending it instead down a man-made channel that fed, eventually, into a different drainage entirely miles from Larkspur Hollow, wasted into a dry basin that supported nothing at all. Breaching it properly so the water would return to its old bed without simply flooding destructively down the canyon, would require careful masonry work, controlled demolition of the old timber crib dam, and the rebuilding of a section of the original creek channel where landslide had buried it, work that would take weeks of skilled labor and that Mercy, with her father's training but only her own 2 hands, could not possibly accomplish alone. She would need help, and she would need the town's cooperation, and both of those things meant she would need to walk into Larkspur Hollow, a place she had not set foot in since her father's funeral, and tell its people a story so strange, that their water had been stolen and hidden for 15 years by the very man who had cast her out, that she half expected to be laughed back out onto the road. She was not laughed away, but neither was she welcomed easily. The town's reaction, when she finally gathered the courage to walk into Larkspur Hollow's one remaining general store and lay her father's papers on the counter before its keeper, an aging, skeptical woman named Odessa Fry who had buried 2 husbands and outlasted 3 sheriffs and trusted almost nothing she had not personally verified, was a slow, suspicious quiet that Mercy understood and did not resent. For the town had been disappointed before, had watched prospectors and speculators and dreamers come through with promises of one kind or another for 15 years, and had learned the hard wisdom of believing nothing until it was proven. It was Odessa herself, after 3 days of turning the papers over in her hands and writing out, against her own arthritic knees' protests, to see the hidden stone room with her own eyes, who finally stood up in the back of her store before the dozen or so families who remained in town and said, in her flat, unsentimental way, that whatever else was true, Thomas Calloway had never in 30 years told this town a lie, and that his daughter had his same steady eyes, and that the town owed it to itself, having so little left to lose, to at least go and look at the water with their own eyes before deciding the whole thing was foolishness. It was the looking that turned the tide, for there is something in the sight of water running where it should never have stopped running that moves even the most hardened doubt, and the small party that rode out with Mercy to the old diversion dam, men and a few sturdy women who still remembered the creek from their childhoods, stood at the rotting timber crib structure with its slow steady seep of escaping water and understood, almost without needing the papers explained again, exactly what had been done to them. Word spread through Larkspur Hollow faster than Mercy could have managed alone, and within a week she had, if not universal trust, at least the cautious cooperation of enough hands willing to work that the project, impossible for one woman alone, began to seem merely difficult, which after the loneliness of the last weeks felt to Mercy almost like abundance. Hollis Pruitt did not remain ignorant of what was happening for long, and his opposition, when it came, was neither subtle nor honorable. He rode into Larkspur Hollow on a gray morning in late April with 2 hired men and a lawyer's letter, and stood in the muddy main street declaring loudly that the water rights belonged legally to his late mother's estate, of which he was sole executor, that the diversion dam stood on company land he held clear title to, and that anyone who laid a hand on it, including his own disinherited stepsister, would face trespass charges and worse, a threat backed by the obvious fact that he had money. For lawyers and the town did not. He had clearly hoped that the mere mention of legal consequence would be enough to scatter the town's fragile new resolve, and for a day or two it nearly was, several families quietly withdrawing their offered labor, fearful of debts called in or worse, and Mercy felt the whole fragile structure of cooperation she had built beginning to crack beneath her, the same way her own claim to her father's house had cracked beneath Hollis's lawyers years before. But Mercy had spent her childhood learning to read what was solid in stone and what was not, and she understood, studying her father's papers late into the night by the light of a borrowed lamp, that Hollis's legal position was far weaker than his confidence suggested. The territorial water use statute her father had annotated so carefully in his notebook was explicit and, crucially, well established in precedent, that any water right claimed under the old company charter and left entirely unused, with no beneficial application of the water for a period of more than 10 consecutive years, reverted automatically to the public domain regardless of who held the original paper title, precisely so that men could not hoard water rights the way they hoarded land. starving whole valleys for the sake of a dormant claim. Hollis Pruitt had done nothing with that water for 15 years. He had not even known, in truth, exactly what he held, having absorbed the old charter as a minor asset among his mother's papers without ever fully understanding its significance until Mercy's project forced his hand. Mercy rode 3 days to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, the same office where she had spent 4 of her last $11 to register her father's deed, and filed, with the help of a young clerk sympathetic to her cause and impressed by the thoroughness of her father's old surveys, a formal challenge to the dormant water claim under the use it or lose it doctrine, a challenge that would take the courts weeks to resolve but that, critically, entitled her under the same statute to proceed with restoration work on her own land while the claim was pending, since the breach point itself, the old dam's eastern abutment, sat squarely within the 60 acres her father had left her. The worthless Waterfall acres Hollis had never thought to examine closely enough to realize their true position. It was a narrow legal thread and Mercy knew it, but it was enough, combined with the town's slowly hardening anger at finally understanding the scope of what had been done to them, to hold the work together through the difficult weeks that followed. Hollis returned twice more, once with his lawyer's increasingly nervous letters, for the clerk in Cheyenne had quietly informed several other landholders of the precedent Mercy's challenge might set, threatening dormant claims across the territory and drawing unwelcome scrutiny to exactly how Hollis had acquired so many of his other holdings, and once in person, red-faced and shouting in the muddy street that Mercy was a thief and a liar trading on a dead man's fantasies, an outburst that backfired badly when half the town, gathered now in numbers Hollis had not expected, simply stood in silence and let him shout himself hoarse before Odessa Fry, with the flat, unhurried authority of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and feared very little left in this world, told him plainly that he was no longer welcome on Larkspur Hollow's main street and that the town had decided, whatever the courts eventually ruled, to trust the daughter over the stepson, for the daughter's father had built this town's well-being into stone with his own hands for 30 years while Hollis had only ever taken. The work itself, once it finally began in earnest in the warm weeks of early June, was the hardest and the most joyful labor Mercy had ever known. She directed the breach of the old timber dam herself, having studied her father's notes until she understood the structure as well as he had, working alongside a dozen men and women of Larkspur Hollow who had once known her only as the quiet girl from the Callaway place and now looked to her, with a respect that still sometimes startled her, as the one who understood the land's hidden architecture better than anyone living. They worked the dam apart in careful stages rather than all at once, exactly as her father's notes had specified, so that the released water would find its old channel gently rather than tearing destructively down a canyon that had forgotten, in 15 years, how to hold a full creek. Mercy herself laid the first new stones where landslide had buried the original creek bed, setting them in the Callaway lock pattern her father had taught her, the same pattern she had found sealing the door of his hidden room, so that in a real sense the wall that had once hidden the truth from the valley was being unbuilt at the very moment a new wall, built in the same hands same pattern, was helping return the truth, in the form of running water, to the people who had been thirsting for. The morning the water finally ran free down its old course and into the dry bed above Larkspur Hollow for the first time in 15 years was, by every account later given, one that the town remembered for the rest of its days. Word had spread that the breach was nearly complete, and nearly the whole town walked the 2 miles up canyon to watch, children running ahead, old men leaning on canes they normally left at home, and when the final stones were pulled away and the creek surged forward, brown with disturbed silt at first and then, within an hour, running clear and cold and full down its rightful bed, there was a silence among the gathered townsfolk that Mercy would later say was louder than any cheering could have been, a silence of people watching something they had given up hoping for simply happen, right in front of them in the plain light of a June morning. Odessa Fry, who did not cry by her own frequent declaration openly, was seen to wipe her eyes twice before pretending to have dust in them. The territorial court's ruling on Hollis's dormant claim, when it finally arrived 3 weeks later, was almost an afterthought by then, the water already running, the town already transformed, though the ruling itself was unambiguous, finding that the Larkspur Silver Company's water rights had indeed lapsed through 15 years of non-use and reverted fully to the public domain, available now to be administered, at the town's own formal request and with Mercy Callaway named as steward of the original headworks on her own land, for the benefit of Larkspur Hollow's farms and families in perpetuity. Hollis Pruitt left the territory entirely within the year, his other dormant claims having drawn exactly the unwelcome legal scrutiny Mercy's challenge had set in motion, his reputation in the only community that had ever truly known him left in ruins not by any vengeance Mercy sought but simply by the plain, patient unfolding of truth he had spent so long trying to keep buried. Settle in and remember Mercy Calloway, the woman who at 31 years old was cast out with $11 and a deed to land everyone called worthless, because that is precisely what this story has always been about, the difference between what the world calls worthless and what is simply waiting, patient as stone beneath moving water, to be properly understood. Her father had not failed her by leaving her a waterfall instead of a house. He had trusted her, more than he trusted anyone else alive, to walk through the roar and the cold and the dark and find what he had hidden there, not gold, not silver, but the one thing that could restore an entire valley to life. Mercy Calloway never did reclaim the house Hollis had taken, never sought to punish him beyond the plain unfolding of consequence his own choices had set in motion, for that was never the inheritance she cared about. She built, instead, a small home for herself near the falls, using stone she set with her own hands in her father's pattern, and she became, for the rest of her long life in Larkspur Hollow, the woman the town turned to whenever something seemed too broken, too dry, too far gone to be worth saving, because she alone among them had learned, in the hardest classroom there is, that almost nothing truly is. Thank you for spending this time with Mercy's story and with us. If this tale moved you, we hope you'll consider sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that what looks worthless to the world is sometimes only waiting for the right pair of eyes. We'd love to know in the comments below about a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off, a person, a place, a piece of land, or even a part of yourself. We read every story you share with us and they shape the tales we choose to tell next. Until next time, stay close.